Hello dear viewers of my channel, this is a new part of the manhwa. Before the beginning of the video I want to thank this guy for the donation. This is the second time he supports the channel financially, for which I am very grateful to him. Thank you, friend. I also want to tell you a little information about Lloyd. The season is over and the author took a break, so the new part of Lloyd will be small, and for a few months there will be no video on him. I wish you all an enjoyable viewing experience. There was a huge number of people on the Plaza Frontera going about their daily lives. The grandfather asked the guy if he had heard about the news that was about the small palace, and the guy who ended up not being able to become a nurse had not heard anything. The old man told the guy that the crown prince had sold off almost all the things from the palace. One of the girls said that she had heard that it was done to get money to maintain the clinic. The boy was shocked that the prince sold all the wealth to continue taking care of the patients. The old man said it was just like that, and the prince seemed like a wonderful man. All the people thought the protagonist was a great person, and they also said that even in history books such people are rare. All people believed that the protagonist was literally an angel in the flesh. While the protagonist himself thought that he needed to earn money as soon as possible, he thought that only in this way he could survive in this body. At that time, one of his subordinates asked if the prince was really going to make his own medicine and sell it. The man said that it might be better to just start charging at least a minimal fee to patients. The protagonist said that they couldn't do that, because if they did, there would be fewer patients, while thinking that he needed to see as many patients as possible in order to prolong his life. The protagonist said that he would never take money from patients and would not do so in the future. He said that he was going to make money from medicines that would be expensive and luxurious, so much so that people would take them to show off to others. The prince started talking about how it would be his signature product. He also said that he would release it personally. Then he said that any family that would have any money and status would want this medicine. The prince, with an incredibly enthusiastic look, said that he would create a super medicine that would be super expensive. The guys didn't understand what this mysterious medicine was that had such status, while the protagonist stated that this medicine would use the Minotaur gallstone. The prince revealed that the medicine would be called the Minotaur Golden Sedative Pill. In the past life of the protagonist, this medicine had incredible power, because it was able to calm people's nerves. A while later, the prince and Damien were walking down the street. Damien asked if the prince was really going to make this mysterious medicine and sell it, and the prince replied that that was exactly what he was going to do. The protagonist also said that he had full confidence that people would use the drug. He also said that people would think it was rare and would want it for that reason. The prince said that they will be using incredibly rare products, because the medicine will be from a minotaur. The protagonist said that the effect of the medicine will be marvelous, and people will definitely buy it. Damien stated that people would definitely not buy such a medicine. Damien stated that this was the first time he had heard of such a medicine, and if it really has such an incredible effect, then why wasn't it famous until now? The prince began to make up a story about a fallen kingdom in which the medicine was famous, and the prince said that the kingdom was called Josian, and Damien said he had never heard of such a name, while the prince confessed that he had seen the kingdom in his dreams. The protagonist also said with a smile on his face that he had learned all his powers in his dreams, and Damien looked at the prince in silence, thinking that what he had said was hardly true. Damien thought that the doctor was really too naive to believe what the prince was saying. He continued to stare at the prince in silence and then thought that all he really cared about was whether or not the prince could pay him steadily. Damien was surprised that the prince was going to treat patients without a license. Such words shocked the prince, who did not know that a license was required. The protagonist, with sweat on his face, listened to the fact that there is an exam on whether a person can get the right to treat people. The prince confessed that he didn't know that such a thing existed, while hoping that it wouldn't be a problem for him. The protagonist said that in any case they needed to solve their financial problems first, and he also said that they just didn't have the right ingredients, which made the prince decide that they needed to buy a live minotaur. Damien asked the prince if he was going to go to Creo, where one of the biggest auction houses was, and the prince said he was going to go there. The protagonist said that he was going to personally assess the minotaur's condition and also its gallstones. Damien thought about the fact that he continued to get the feeling that the prince had simply begun to lose his mind. While the carriage with the prince was moving along the road, the girl was sitting on its roof and looking around. The protagonist turned to his knight and said that it was time for them to leave. They started to move towards the carriage, to Damien's surprise that they were leaving at once. Suddenly the prince's face changed completely, and he shouted for Damien to start moving quickly, for an incredible danger was approaching them. As a result, the map began to move, and the doctor tried to catch up with his prince at a great speed. The doctor began to cry hysterically because the prince just left him, although he is his main doctor. The protagonist shouted that he needed the doctor to look after the clinic while he was away. The carriages continued on their way, and Damien noticed that the carriage was much more comfortable than he had imagined. The protagonist saying that because he was the crown prince, he was traveling in incredible comfort. The guys also unanimously stated that their location was incredibly strange. From that moment, exactly 8 days passed. The girl was lying on the roof of the carriage as suddenly she opened her eyes, then immediately jumped up from her seat. It turned out that she had just smelled a very clear smell of the sea. The girl immediately reported to the protagonist that she saw the port behind the hill. It turned out they were at the sea. And the port itself was an incredibly beautiful place. Huge ships that were approaching the land, as well as a huge number of people who were watching interesting goods. The prince carefully watched the life of the place. Then they were right in front of the auction house of monsters Creo. The wagon of the protagonist began to stop. The man who stood at the door seemed not to expect that someone would arrive in this place, because of which he said that the old man should put the wagon in another place, because he simply cannot park here. The old man instantly told the guy that he had no idea who was in the carriage, and he mockingly suggested that the crown prince himself. The protagonist said hello to the insolent guy, which instantly caused him to panic. It seemed the kid did not expect that he could at least once meet the prince. Sometime later, the nobleman was surrounded by his servants. The boy ran towards the nobleman at a great speed, and the man who was the mayor of the place asked what happened. The boy began to breathe deeply, because he was running at great speed and tired, and then pointed in the direction of the protagonist with the words that the crown prince himself had come to them. The mayor of the place was as shocked as the guy before. The mayor instantly started sucking up to the protagonist. Then he asked what brought such an important person to this place. The protagonist confessed that he was going to buy something in this place. The mayor immediately offered to provide the protagonist with additional bodyguards. But the prince immediately refused. The prince pointed to his men saying that he already had personal guards. The prince told the mayor that he would leave as soon as he looked around the place. The protagonist started to get annoyed because the mayor simply wouldn't shut up. The prince started to leave with the words that he would check in with the mayor later, and the mayor instantly said goodbye to the protagonist. The mayor instantly ordered his men to clean up the palace while the protagonist thought about the people suffering because of him. While a huge minotaur was lying in a cage at the auction, a huge number of people started bidding to buy it. While the prince along with Damien were watching carefully, Damien was surprised, for he had expected the place to be noisy, but it was quiet. The prince suggested that it might be because it was a monster auction house. Damien also said that it was probably because the monsters would just wake up if it was too noisy. In the arena, one of the monsters began to be taken away and another one was brought in, and people were also actively bidding while the auction master was broadcasting. The prince began to yawn with boredom, for it turned out that there hadn't been a single minotaur during the entire auction. Suddenly, it was incredibly difficult for the horses to carry the next item of this auction. Inside was a huge monster. The prince began to stare intently in the direction of the minotaur, which had an incredibly powerful jaw, and a moment later the monster began to scream incredibly loudly. The prince was shocked at how huge the monster was, and assumed that this was what he wanted. The auction master announced that this was the highlight of their event today, a real minotaur. The guy talked about how a huge amount of people, resources, and time had been used to hunt this monster. The prince instantly realized that he just needed this minotaur. The protagonist was out of joy and was going to kill this monster and use it for his medicine. Suddenly the man said that they are starting to sell this monster with a price of 50,000 Megan. The protagonist did not understand what was happening because the final price of other monsters was the same, but in the minotaur only the starting price has reached such a value. Damien assumed that the hero took enough money while the prince only brought 100,000 Megan. The protagonist thought about the fact that it was all his money, and he simply could not spend it on a single minotaur. The prince also saw the reaction of other people who also wanted to buy this minotaur. The prince thought that even for 100,000 he could not buy this monster. The protagonist thought that for such incredible money he could buy a luxurious house. The prince began to think furiously about how he could get this monster, because he simply could not afford to miss such an incredible specimen. Suddenly the protagonist had an idea and turned to Damien and started talking very quietly in his ear. Damien was surprised that the prince was trying to pull something like this. He said that the order the prince was going to give him was really gangster, while the protagonist asked if it would be a problem, and Damien got up from his seat saying that he would be back soon. As people began to place their bets, the amount instantly went from 53,000 to 55,000. The prince was well aware that he was not going to make it at this rate and was worried that Damien was taking too long to do his job. Suddenly the mayor arrived with a huge number of people. The protagonist asked the mayor what the mayor was doing in this place, but he did not understand what the prince was talking about, while the prince began to look very insistently into the eyes of the man who could not understand the prince's thoughts. The mayor thought about the fact that his political career was built on a sharp mind, and he perfectly understood the prince's gaze. The mayor realized that the prince wanted others to know who he was. The mayor started coughing before he started to speak. Then he started shouting to the whole hall for the crown prince to listen to his request. All the people were shocked when they heard that the crown prince himself had come to this place. The mayor said that 100 bodyguards were waiting for the prince's orders, which the other people were watching closely. The prince said he would gladly accept the man's good intentions, and then they started laughing together while Damien tried not to listen to the irritable laughter. The prince returned to his seat saying that he had forgotten that the auction was going on. Then he began to write the amount on the plaque, and a moment later he raised the bid to 60,000. All the people instantly realized that they were fools, because the crown prince himself was interested in this monster, and now they couldn't bid. The prince was sure that no one would dare to bid because he was the heir to the state. All people understood that. At this point the guy gloated. All the people who were at the auction were upset, because they lost the opportunity to get such a desirable monster. The auction master was also shocked that the crown prince had come to them, but he also thought that they simply could not sell their best product for only 60,000, because they had spent a huge amount of effort to catch this monster. The auction master was very upset, and seemed to think that they would suffer a huge loss. At that time there was a man sitting in the hall and smiling very slyly. He raised the bid up to 70,000, after which the entire room instantly turned their attention to him. The auction master was shocked that someone dared to bid, but was also happy about it. All the people started discussing about the strange person who dared to raise the bid. While the prince recognized this person, it was Guinness. All people discussed that the mysterious man was favored by the king of the southern country. The man smiled and thought about what the prince would do in this situation. Because he is not a citizen of the empire, people whispered that the man is their savior, and that he will put in place of the prince. The protagonist began to get very angry after hearing the conversations of people around. Eventually a spark of war broke out between them. They were going to fight with money. The prince instantly started writing a new amount on the board. Then it turned out that he had only raised the bid by 1,000 money, and the man did the same, so the bidding battle continued between them while the beast watched very closely. The auction master announced that their main item had been sold for 250,000, which instantly made the man happy that he was able to defeat the crown prince himself. While the protagonist himself was shattered by this defeat, tears welled up in his eyes as the item he coveted began to be taken away, while Damien stated that he was actually glad that the prince had lost the battle. He started to say that it would be too inefficient to spend that much money on a minotaur at a time. The prince thought the guy's words were nice. He seemed to genuinely care about him. But suddenly Damien said that if the prince spent the money he wouldn't be able to pay his wages. Then he said with full confidence on his face that he was only following the prince for one reason, and that was to pay him. Such words seemed to hurt the prince, who didn't expect to hear it so openly. The prince asked if the guy was grateful for his rescue, and he said that although he was grateful, the money was a different matter. The prince assumed that Damien's gratitude didn't depend on financial matters, and so it was. The prince looked closely at the guy. He thought about the fact that in the novel the protagonist of the story, namely Damien, had incredible potential. The prince thought that basically the strongest man of this universe was protecting him. The protagonist thought that he should make sure that Damien sought a stable life with him. The prince told Damien not to worry because he wouldn't let the guy's paycheck get delayed. The protagonist wanted to go straight to the mayor's residence, and the mayor said that's what they would do. The mayor didn't understand why they were running away from the place, while the hero thought that he was ashamed to lose even by resorting to dirty tricks. At that time the man who defeated the hero silently watched and observed. Sometime later it was night outside. In the man's manner the minotaur was on the floor shrouded in strong chains. The minotaur began to come to his senses and open his eyes, and the first thing he began to see in front of him was a strange man who stood right in front of him and said nothing. The man said in his ear that the Minotaur's condition seemed much better up close than from far away. The man bragged to his man about being able to defeat the crown prince, and that the hero had a funny face when he lost. The guy started to approach the man, then asked if they would proceed with the process. The man said that the guy was the best taxidermist in the place, and the man said that the man paid very generously. The bull listened as the guys discussed what pose to kill it in. The man said that the monster should look incredibly majestic because he was going to give it as a gift to the king. The boy assumed that the man wanted to give the gift to the king with an image of power. The man said that he had also prepared a magician to help them make the effigy. The magician came into the room, realizing that the guys were busy people, and said he would get down to business immediately. Eventually he stood in front of the chained monster, then started using void magic to kill the monster. Eventually the monster started to feel terrible pain. It seemed he was only thinking that people were incredibly evil. He remembered his past where everything was fine until people attacked him and his family. Then he was locked in a cage and how he ended up in this place where they were hurting and trying to kill him. The monster started to rise up on its feet, which started to scare the man. They saw an incredibly creepy creature in front of them. As suddenly the monster was able to free itself from its shackles and screamed with all its might. At the time, everything was quiet near the manor where the prince was. The prince complained that he felt lousy and Damien thought that the guy had overworked himself. The bodies opened a protest against the schedule of the day because they were getting tired, while the prince clenched his fist and said that he would definitely buy a minotaur the next day. As suddenly a very loud noise was heard, people rushed inside the room and said that they were in incredibly big trouble. Damien asked what was going on and one of the men said they had to evacuate the prince to a safe place. The prince asked the men to explain normally what was going on. Suddenly there was an explosion not far away and Damien instantly got ready to fight, but incredibly quickly Damien missed an incredibly strong blow right on his body. After that he was stuck in the wall, and the main character did not understand how this could happen because Damien was incredibly strong while the paw of the monster was approaching the hero, who stood and did not understand what had just happened. Then he instantly looked in the direction where the Minotaur was, and right in front of him was an incredibly huge creature, which seemed to be unable to stop anyone. The prince was simply shocked that the Minotaur he wanted to buy was in front of him. Some time ago the Minotaur began to release a huge amount of power, after which it was released from the shackles created by people. Instantly the room in which this was happening began to crack, the people inside were under the rubble, and the man who bought the Minotaur sat on the ground and did not understand how this could happen. The Minotaur began to scream thinking that this man was the most evil person. The Minotaur instantly got ready to strike and then struck, but the man managed to slip away from this weighty blow at the last moment. The man started shouting at the Minotaur saying that he was a big merchant, but a while later he was already on the street and was running away at a great speed. The man shouted that the Minotaur would not come closer to him, and also shouted that he no longer wanted to be the master of this monster. The Minotaur chased the man, who while running thought about how he could find a safe place. Suddenly he turned his attention to the mayor's residence and pointed his finger in that direction, which surprisingly worked, and the Minotaur instantly switched his attention to that building while the man hid around the corner. When the Minotaur came to his senses he realized that the man had managed to escape. Then the monster's face showed signs of anger and he hit the building with all his might, which instantly began to crack. In the present the Minotaur stood right in front of the hero, who was incredibly frightened by the presence of such a huge monster. The Minotaur began to approach. He looked incredibly creepy and evil. The protagonist did not understand why the monster's eyes looked like that. He understood perfectly well that the monster was in agony and just did not know what to do, which was like the eyes of a patient. The monster seemed to recognize the protagonist, for it was he who was then bidding to buy the monster at the auction. The monster howled with anger thinking that the prince is also an incredibly evil man. The protagonist did not understand why the monster was angry at him. While the monster itself began to approach, it moved slowly, but from such a terrible sight anyone would have panicked. The Minotaur swung to finish off the prince, who covered his face with his hand, and Damien finally regained consciousness and started to rise to his feet. Damien saved the prince's life by fending off the monster's attack. Then the guy instantly asked the prince to run away, because the situation was extremely dangerous. The protagonist started to run away saying that he didn't want to die in such a place, because he did a lot to stay alive. While the monster continued to get angry, he seemed to be enraged by what was happening. The monster started throwing a huge number of punches, while Damien tried his best to block these fast attacks that had incredible power. The monster watched the prince trying to escape from this place, and then he aimed his blow not towards Damien, but towards the prince, who didn't even have time to react. Damien intervened in time and kicked the protagonist with his foot, which eventually saved the prince's life, who was now thinking that Damien had kicked him. Suddenly the ceiling began to crack and a huge boulder fell right next to the protagonist. It turned out that they were now trapped and could not get out of the building. Damien was watching carefully and thinking about something. It seemed his thoughts were on something very important, as he suddenly spoke about if they could survive the day he wanted something. Then he stunned the prince by saying that he would like to get a prize for it. The main character was amazed that Damien would ask for such a thing in such a situation and asked what would happen if he didn't give the bonus, to which Damien replied that he would just run away alone. Damien said that in 3 seconds he would attack the Minotaur and the prince should run away. The protagonist didn't understand where he should run to, because there was a huge monster in front of him and Damien was preparing to attack. Damien pointed his finger at a hole in the wall and the prince instantly started screaming that they were on the 2nd floor, to Damien's words that the prince should just jump. Damien said it was better to jump from the 2nd floor than to be killed. While outside, the mayor ordered the soldiers to rescue the prince by all means. The prince assumed that even if he fell and broke his legs, the men outside would be able to catch him and take him to safety. Damien gripped his own blade tightly, and then he instantly attacked the Minotaur and the prince began to move towards the exit. Damien pushed himself away from the Minotaur's arm, then he was right in front of it, preparing to strike with his sword. Damien was able to strike the attack right on the monster's head. While the prince didn't make it to the exit at all, the prince was ducked right into the hole. While the Minotaur was screaming in anger, the protagonist thought about the fact that his life turned out to be quite bad. Suddenly something huge appeared right in front of the prince's face, and the guy instantly grabbed the hand of this huge creature, which with bright red eyes looked in the direction of the prince. Suddenly in front of the protagonist appeared a system window, the contents of which shocked the guy. Full scanning of the Minotaur began, and in front of the protagonist began to appear all the characteristics of the monster. It turns out the heart of the Minotaur was in a terrible state, because he received a huge amount of tranquilizers and consumed a lot of Zalkoff. Turns out that the Minotaur was also experiencing incredible pain in his heart, and if ignored, it could lead to cardiac arrest. The prince was shocked by this information because according to it, the pain that the Minotaur is experiencing is just terrible. The protagonist assumed that the monster was furious because of the pain he was experiencing. Suddenly the monster started yanking his arm, trying to throw off the protagonist, who was screaming that he was in great danger. The prince was well aware that if he fell down now he would surely be crushed, as the monster prepared to strike the prince. Suddenly there was a sound of impact. It turned out that Damien attacked the monster right on its horns. Damien planned to hit the eye but missed and hit the horn of the monster. Damien stepped back a little while the Minotaur looked in his direction. Damien started shouting that the prince needed to hold on just a little longer and he would save him immediately. While the protagonist was crying and holding on to the monster's hide with all his might, Damien was closing the distance between him and his opponent at breakneck speed. While preparing for the attack, he started thinking that he was going to strike a series of blows. Damien was getting closer and closer, thinking that the blows were unlikely to be deep. But in the end he delivered. The first blow of the series, followed by another one, which made the monster scream, and the prince held on with all his might. It seemed that soon he would fall down. As it happened, the prince could not hold on to the monster and let go of his hands, after which the protagonist began to fall at a great speed down, while shouting that Damien will definitely not get his bonuses. Tears came to the prince's eyes. He thought the weather was perfect for dying, as suddenly something at a great speed started racing down the street, after which a girl instantly grabbed the prince right in the air. The protagonist did not expect to see a niece in such a situation. While the mayor's servants were worried about the prince and his condition, they immediately started asking if he was okay, and the protagonist said that he was fine. The guy immediately started shouting that they should leave because the prince's safety was their priority. They started leaving the battle site together while the Minotaur was watching closely. It seemed like it was not going to let the protagonist go so easily. Then it started screaming with all its might and suddenly looked towards Damien with an incredibly mad look. Damien assumed that the monster was very angry that he had lost the prince. He also held out his blade in front of him and assumed that the monster had decided to switch to him. The Minotaur instantly threw an incredibly strong blow, while Damien dodged it. While thinking that he was going to ask for a raise from the prince, the enemy prepared to deliver another heavy blow, while Damien wanted to pierce the monster's arm as he struck. Damien's attacks collided and caused a huge surge of energy. It turned out to be much harder to do than he had planned, and the guy's body was shaking while the monster started screaming again, both from anger and from the pain he was feeling. A fierce fight continued between them, and after the collision the monster removed his hand and Damien retreated some distance. The monster started to move towards the guy. Its speed was unimaginable considering that it weighed over 14 tons. Damien instantly tried to block the enemy's attack with his sword, but the enemy seemed to expect the guy to try to block, and as a result Damien noticed a movement near his head for a moment, but as a result he didn't react accurately enough and missed the incredibly strong attack. The walls of the building began to crack, and then the entire building began to collapse as other people watched, startled by the debris that almost fell on them. As Damien let go of his sword, he seemed to take a huge amount of damage. Damien was trapped as one of the building pieces fell on his foot. As the sound of hooves got closer and closer, the monster was right in front of the helpless Damien, who couldn't resist. The Minotaur prepared to deliver a crushing blow right on the guy, who was trying with all his might to free his leg from the boulder. It was only a moment before the blow of this monster would finish Damien, who was well aware that right now his life would be over, as suddenly the hedgehog hit right on the body of the huge monster. That instantly caused pain and the monster began to scream with anger. This shocked Damien, who recently said goodbye to his life, while the monster continued to scream with pain and rage. Damien in turn did not understand what was happening, because the prince did not run away, but stayed and tried to fight with the monster. The protagonist was very happy. He thought that the red seeds made his pet much bigger. The prince yelled for Damien to move, and also added that it was time for them to make money. Damien started talking about how he was expecting an incredibly large sum of money from the prince. While the prince was yelling at the guy to get out as soon as possible, Damien cut the cobblestone that was restricting his movement. His leg seemed to be very hurt by it. Damien didn't understand why his leg just wouldn't listen to him. While the Minotaur seemed to be able to regain consciousness, he grabbed the hedgehog and separated it from his body, then threw it towards the prince with great force. The prince shouted for Damien to grab the prickly pet as soon as possible, and the boy did as the prince ordered. Then Damien was finally able to be outside. He instantly landed with the prince's pet. While the Minotaur was shocked by this outcome of events, the protagonist along with Damien looked towards his opponent. Suddenly, a blow with a blade sounded, after which the whole building started to collapse right on the monster's head. The whole building collapsed right in front of the protagonist and Damien, who had just made the blow. The guys silently looked towards the building, hoping that they could defeat the monster. The prince began to praise the crumb, because it was only thanks to him that they were able to win this battle. The protagonist immediately asked how Damien was feeling, and he said that he was feeling fine, even though he looked very shabby. The protagonist looked at the destruction thinking about the monster. The prince knew that the Minotaur was unlikely to die from such a crash, and he would be taking a big risk if he went after its body. The prince said that they should leave the place as soon as possible, as the mayor suddenly appeared, who immediately turned to the prince. The mayor said that he was going to escort the protagonist to a safe place. The mayor said that he was going to take the prince to the safest place in the city. Sometime later the ship was near the harbor. The protagonist and his friends were moving in that direction. The mayor began to say that once the prince gets on the ship and sails into the sea, no matter how angry the Minotaur is, he will not be able to get him. The prince thought that such an escape was a very good decision indeed. He started to step onto the boat, as suddenly the prince noticed that the mayor remained standing still and asked him to move with them to the boat. The mayor with a serious expression said that he was staying in the city. The prince could not understand why the man had to do that, but he explained that as mayor he was fully responsible for the city. He said that if he tried to escape alone, many people would get hurt and he would regret it. The mayor said that he would command the guards in the city and ask the prince to go to a safe place. The prince was a little upset because he originally thought that the mayor was a frivolous man, but in the end he is staying in the city with the people even though it is dangerous. Damien told the prince that they had to hurry, because every second counted. Damien began to say that the prince didn't need to feel guilty for running away, because everyone in this world had a role to play. The prince stared at his subordinate and then they began to leave for the boat. The protagonist was on the ship with his men. The prince felt it was his duty as a prince to survive and lead this state. The crew instantly began to raise the sails, after which the ship began its movement while the mayor saluted the prince. Suddenly one of the crew members of the ship noticed something very strange. It turned out to be a Minotaur at great speed approaching the shore of this city. The monster instantly made an incredibly strong jump. then instantly found himself near the prince, who seemed to have relaxed after the ship began to move. The Minotaur landed directly on the ship, causing the ship to take damage. The monster started screaming with all his might. Then the monster grabbed onto the wooden mount. Then the prince instantly ordered all of his men to duck, and the monster struck directly at the prince, who was able to dodge the attack at the last moment. The prince did not understand what to do in this situation because he could not escape at all. It turns out that the main character could not swim at all, while the organs were very much worried and begged the prince to use his brains, which were not with them, which upset the prince. Damien asked the prince to keep his head down. Even though they had lost the sail, Damien asked the prince to stay close to the stern and not move. The prince was surprised at this plan, and the boy explained that it was the best place to hide. The prince asked what Damien would be doing at that time, and he confessed that he would soon receive a very large reward. Damien gripped his blade tightly, saying that it was time for him to get to work. The prince looked closely at his subordinate, and then he immediately started to move to the safety of the ship. Damien at the same time went on a furious attack towards the monster. It turned out Anise was also preparing to attack the Minotaur. They attacked the huge monster together. But the monster grabbed Anise by the tail. The monster easily scattered all the people who tried to attack it. Damien himself seemed unable to fight effectively because his leg was damaged. In just a few seconds all. The people were defeated by the Minotaur. The prince was very aware that things were going very badly. The protagonist started to look at the bull, thinking that he needed to analyze it immediately. Suddenly the system window notified the prince that he was in an incredibly dangerous situation. So the protagonist was able to awaken Azrahan's triple diagnostic ability. The protagonist was incredibly excited about the new ability. It turns out the ability allowed him to predict what kind of movements the enemy would perform. The protagonist fixed the skill on the monster. The prince still didn't understand what was going on. The prince began to slowly leave his hiding place. He thought about how long he would be able to dodge the attacks of this monster. The protagonist thought that he had to do something before he was exhausted. The prince began to think furiously about what he could do against such an enemy. He thought about the people who had been defeated in the battle and were now in danger. Suddenly the prince's eyes became confident, and then he turned his attention to the pet, which was also hit by the monster. It seemed that the prince had thought of something, but he was not sure if he could do it. The prince was going to do his best, because that was the duty that was piled on his shoulders. The monster started moving towards the defenseless people. They were very scared at the sight of such a terrible beast, as suddenly people were amazed that the prince appeared in front of them, who blocked the attack of this huge monster. The monster also did not understand what was happening. While the system complained that the prince illegally used the seeds intended for pets. Thank you all so much for watching this clip to the end. Really thank you guys. As I said in the beginning, I will release the last part of Lloyd very soon. Maybe I will make a compilation. After that there will be a pause because the output of chapters stopped. In general, we hope that the chapters will be published as soon as possible. Thank you all for your attention. See you soon.